Have you ever felt the kind of fear that wakes you from sleep with your heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat, only to realize that the terror has followed you into the waking world? My name is Elias Stroud, and I'm a folklore researcher, a seeker of forgotten tales and dark truths hidden in the shadows of human history. But nothing I've read or written prepared me for what happened one fateful night. It all began with a dream so vivid, so suffocatingly real, that it seemed like more than a mere construct of my subconscious. What unfolded was the beginning of a journey into something far darker than I could have imagined. Before we plunge into the depths of this haunting experience, I urge you to subscribe and like this video, because the stories I share here are not just for entertainment. They're a warning, a glimpse into the sinister unknown. It was an ordinary night, like countless others. The kind of night where the world outside is quiet, and the only sounds are the gentle hum of a distant wind or the occasional rustle of leaves. I had gone to bed with no expectation of anything unusual, but that night, something changed. I found myself standing at the edge of a forest, a place that seemed both strange and familiar, as if it existed between worlds, the real and the unreal blurring together. The forest was dark, darker than any place I'd ever seen, an impenetrable, ink-black sea of twisted branches and tangled roots. There was something alive in that darkness, something watching from behind the trees. The scent of damp soil, decay, and something acrid filled my senses as I took my first step forward. It wasn't just an ordinary forest smell. It carried a metallic tang, like blood mixed with rotting leaves. My footsteps made almost no sound on the forest floor, which was strangely soft, as if the ground itself was absorbing my presence, trying to pull me deeper. I had an overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be there, that this place was forbidden. I looked around, and for a brief moment, I caught sight of something moving, a shadow, slipping between the trees, just out of my line of sight. The cold breeze picked up, and with it came a low whisper, a voice I couldn't quite understand but felt in my bones, a voice that seemed to be calling my name. The deeper I ventured, the more distorted everything became. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it were trying to push me back. The towering trees, their bark gnarled and split, loomed overhead, and every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something carved into them, strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie light, even in the total absence of any visible source. It was as if the forest itself was alive, its roots writhing just beneath the surface, and I was an intruder, violating some ancient law. Suddenly, a noise echoed, an impossibly loud crack, like a branch being snapped in half right next to my ear. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness, but nothing moved. My pulse quickened, my chest tightened, and a chilling realization settled in. I wasn't alone. There were eyes, many eyes, staring at me from the shadows, glowing faintly with a sickly greenish hue. They didn't blink, they just stared unblinking, as if measuring me, deciding what to do with this trespasser. Panic surged through me, and my feet moved of their own accord, taking me further down a narrow path that twisted like a serpent into the heart of the forest. But as I ran, I heard something else, something I can barely describe. It wasn't quite a growl, nor a scream, but a low, guttural sound that seemed to resonate from the earth itself. It vibrated through my body, and I knew that whatever made that sound was coming closer. I tried to wake up, tried to force myself out of this nightmare, but the forest wouldn't let me go. Every step I took seemed to drag me further from the light, deeper into a darkness that felt infinite, all-consuming. And then, as if on cue, I saw it, a small cabin, its doors slightly ajar, a weak flicker of orange light coming from inside. I knew I shouldn't go in. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee. But my feet, seemingly possessed, moved towards it. The air was colder near the cabin, and as I approached, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer incomprehensible. They were urging me, taunting me, daring me to open that door. And with trembling hands, I pushed it open, stepping into the unknown, unaware that this dream would leave a mark on me far beyond that one terrifying night. So before I take you further into this story, Remember to subscribe, because what happened next is not just a story, it's a warning. A warning to anyone who dares to wander too close to the edge of reality, where nightmares blur with the waking world, and where something dark, something ancient, waits in the shadows. It began as an ordinary dream, a quiet night where the air was heavy with an unsettling calm, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. I found myself standing at the edge of a forest, but this was no ordinary forest. It was vast, with trees so dense that they swallowed the sky, their crooked branches intertwining above to form a barrier against the light. No stars, no moon, only darkness. There was something deeply wrong with this place. A strange sense of familiarity washed over me, like I had been here before, but in another time, or perhaps another life. My gut twisted with unease, an inexplicable fear gnawing at the edges of my mind, urging me to leave before it was too late. The path that led me into the forest was barely visible, a narrow trail of earth that seemed to pulsate as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Each step I took felt labored, as though the ground beneath me resisted my weight, pulling at my feet. The air was thick, laden with the smell of damp moss, decay, and something else, a metallic tang that reminded me of rust or perhaps blood. There was an uncanny quality to the air, like I was breathing in something more than just oxygen, something that seemed to have intent, as if the forest itself was alive and watching my every move. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a soft rustling that seemed to come from just beyond the tree-line. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any shape, but all I could see were shadows, shifting and undulating, as if they had a life of their own. The noise grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just the wind. It was a whisper, a voice, hushed and taunting, saying something I couldn't quite understand. It sent a shiver down my spine, a primal terror that urged me to turn back, to flee from whatever was lurking in the depths of that darkness. But my feet refused to obey. It was as if the path had a grip on me, leading me forward against my will, deeper into the heart of the forest. As I continued, I noticed something hanging from the branches, lanterns, old and rusted, swaying gently without any breeze to move them. The light they emitted was faint, a flickering orange glow that barely cut through the gloom, casting distorted shadows on the forest floor. I reached out to touch one, and the metal was cold, almost painfully so, as if it had been sitting in the dark for centuries. The lantern swung slightly under my fingers, and in that moment, I heard it, a guttural, low growl from behind me, reverberating through the trees. My breath caught, and I spun around, my eyes wide with fear. There was nothing there, only darkness. But I could feel it. Something, or someone, was there, just out of sight, hiding among the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest, the primal instinct of prey in the presence of a predator overwhelming me. The growl came again, closer this time, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble, the vibrations running up my legs. I wanted to wake up, to force myself out of this nightmare, but it felt too real. The biting cold, the rancid smell of decay, the oppressive weight of being watched. This was no ordinary dream. Further down the path, I saw a structure looming in the darkness. A small cabin, decrepit and leaning, its wooden boards splintered and broken. The door was slightly open, and a dim light flickered from within, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to reach out towards me. I knew deep down that stepping inside was a mistake, but something drew me in, a force beyond my understanding. I approached slowly, each step echoing in the unnatural silence, the whispers growing louder with every breath I took. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the sound seemed to echo endlessly, bouncing off unseen walls in the void of the forest. The air inside the cabin was colder, the light flickering erratically from a single candle set upon a table in the center. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood. Symbols I felt I should recognize, though I couldn't place from where. They pulsed faintly, almost as if they were breathing, and as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the entire cabin. In the dim light, I saw something, A shadow standing in the corner, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching me, its gaze piercing through the shadows, freezing me in place. My mouth went dry, and my body refused to respond as the whispers swelled to a deafening roar inside my head, repeating words I could not understand. A sudden gust of wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing the candle, plunging me into absolute darkness. And then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder, fingers digging into my skin, a breath against my ear as the whispers finally became clear, a single word that made my blood run cold. Run. I was paralyzed, frozen by the cold, unseen hand on my shoulder, the word run echoing in my mind like a command from something ancient and unfathomable. Panic surged through me, my instincts screaming to obey, but my feet felt glued to the floor. In the darkness of the cabin, the air grew even colder, almost unbearable, and I could hear my own shaky breathing, amplified by the eerie silence that followed. My eyes darted around, but there was nothing to see, only an oppressive blackness that felt alive, shifting around me, making me feel as though I were standing in a void where time itself had ceased to exist. I took a step back, breaking the stillness, and suddenly the hand released me. I stumbled, my heart pounding, my body flooded with adrenaline as I tried to regain control. Somewhere in that suffocating darkness, something moved, a rustling sound, like dry leaves being crunched underfoot, only it was inside the cabin with me. I squinted, straining my eyes, but all I could see were glimpses of shadows slipping away, dancing just out of reach of my sight, as if mocking my fear. Without warning, a flash of light flickered, a dim lantern that had somehow appeared on the table. It cast a dull, sickly glow, illuminating just enough for me to make out the room. The symbols on the walls had changed. No longer were they mere carvings. They glowed faintly, pulsating with an unnatural light, and the shapes seemed to shift as I stared at them, becoming more intricate, more twisted. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, communicating some forbidden knowledge I was not meant to understand. I felt a chill run down my spine, a deep-rooted fear that whispered in my ear that this place was beyond the ordinary, beyond human comprehension. I glanced at the corner where I had seen the shadow figure earlier, and my stomach dropped. It was gone. The fear of the unknown, of not knowing where it had gone, made my chest tighten. My eyes darted back to the door, now closed, and I took a cautious step toward it, my senses on high alert. As I reached for the handle, the lantern's light flickered and then, all at once, extinguished. Darkness swallowed me again, and I could feel the walls closing in, the symbols seemingly crawling toward me, the room alive with a creeping sense of malice. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, coming from behind me. It wasn't human. The breaths were deep, guttural, each exhale sending a shiver through me, my skin crawling as I felt its presence draw nearer. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating shroud. I turned, my hands trembling, trying to see through the inky black, and there, right in front of me, were two glowing eyes, staring into mine. They were not eyes of any creature I had ever seen. They were empty, black voids, filled with an abyss that seemed to stretch into infinity. Panic overwhelmed me. I lunged for the door, yanking at the handle with all my strength, and it flew open, spilling me out into the forest. The cold air outside hit me like a wave, and I gasped, my lungs burning, my body trembling uncontrollably. I stumbled down the steps of the cabin, barely catching myself from falling, and looked back. The door stood wide open, but the cabin was pitch dark, as if the light from outside couldn't penetrate that space. The whispers had followed me, faint but persistent, weaving through the air like a taunt. They were saying something, a chant that repeated over and over, and though I couldn't understand the words, I felt the meaning deep in my bones. It was a warning, or perhaps a curse. I took a few shaky steps away, trying to put distance between myself and that place, but the forest seemed different now. The trees loomed even taller, their branches reaching for me, and the path that had led me here was gone. In its place was an endless stretch of twisted trunks, their bark cracked and oozing a dark, sap-like substance. My pulse quickened as I realized I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw them. Figures moving between the trees, circling me, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows, but unmistakably there. Every rational thought fled from my mind as terror took over. I ran, blindly pushing through the underbrush, branches slashing at my face and arms, the ground shifting beneath my feet. The forest seemed to move with me, the trees bending and swaying as if they were alive, guiding me deeper into their heart. I could feel the presence behind me, the cold breath on the back of my neck, and the whispers, now a cacophony, drowning out all other sounds, filling my mind with their relentless chant. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. In the distance, I saw a faint glow, a light that promised some semblance of safety. I pushed toward it, my vision blurring, my body on the brink of collapse. As I burst into the clearing, I realized what it was, a single lantern hanging from a twisted tree, the same lantern I had touched earlier. It swung gently, as if mocking me, and I realized, with a sinking feeling of dread, that I had been running in circles. The forest had trapped me, led me back to where it wanted me, and as I stood there panting, staring at that flickering light, I knew that whatever was hunting me wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. The clearing felt wrong, as though it shouldn't exist in this place. A small patch of emptiness surrounded by towering trees that leaned inward, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The lantern swayed slowly in the breeze, its flickering light casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. My breath was ragged, each inhalation burning in my chest as I tried to make sense of my surroundings, but the sense of unease only deepened. It felt like I had been herded here, like a lamb to slaughter, with no escape from whatever was lurking just beyond the tree-line. I stepped closer to the lantern, and that's when I saw it, etched into the bark of the tree from which it hung, the same strange symbols from the cabin, glowing faintly in the dark. They seemed to move as I stared at them, twisting into shapes that almost made sense, that almost spoke to me in a language I should know, but couldn't quite understand. The whispers that had been following me rose again, louder now, almost frantic, and I could feel something, a presence, that seemed to pulse with every beat of my heart. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet of the forest. I spun around, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shifting darkness, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural, moving in a way that defied all logic. Its face, or where a face should have been, was obscured, a black void that seemed to swallow the light around it. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move, frozen in place by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The figure took a step towards me, and as it moved, the whispers became a roar, filling my head, drowning out all rational thought. It raised one long, bony hand, pointing at the lantern, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow. My legs moved of their own accord, my feet dragging across the ground as if I were a puppet, and I reached out towards the flickering light. The air around me grew colder with every step, and the light from the lantern seemed to dim, shrinking until it was nothing more than a faint glow barely illuminating my trembling hand. As my fingers brushed the lantern, the clearing changed. The trees seemed to close in, their branches knitting together to form an unbroken wall of darkness, and the ground beneath me shifted, the earth rippling like water. I looked down and saw that the symbols from the tree were now etched into the ground, glowing with an intensity that made my eyes water. They formed a circle around me, and in that moment I understood. This was a trap. I had been led here, herded like prey, and now there was no escape. The figure moved closer, stepping into the circle of light, and for the first time, I saw its face clearly. It was empty, a void, a darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision, drawing me in. I felt myself being swallowed by it, my mind slipping away, the whispers now inside me, echoing in my bones. I tried to fight it, to pull away, but it was like trying to move through water, every action slow and futile. The darkness spread, enveloping me, until there was nothing left but the figure and the void. And then suddenly, there was a sound, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to come from all around me. The figure froze, its head snapping towards the source of the noise, and for a brief moment, the pressure lifted. I took the chance, lunging backward, breaking free from the circle, and as I did, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, the world spinning around me, the lantern's light fading into a distant pinprick as I plunged into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs, and for a moment, I just lay there, staring up at the swirling mass of branches above me, the whispers now a distant murmur. I was back in the forest, somewhere deeper, the clearing and the figure now gone, but I knew I wasn't safe. The symbols, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was all still there, just beyond my senses, waiting for the right moment to strike. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, my entire body aching, and looked around. The forest was darker here, the trees even more twisted, their roots writhing across the ground like serpents. In the distance, I saw a faint glow, another lantern, hanging from a branch, swaying gently in the non-existent breeze. A sense of dread settled in my stomach, but I knew I had no choice. There was no going back, only forward, deeper into the dark, where the line between nightmare and reality blurred, and the true horror of the forest waited to reveal itself. I moved towards a light, every step heavy, my heart pounding in my ears, and as I approached, I saw something beneath the lantern, an object, half buried in the dirt. I knelt down, brushing away the loose soil, and my blood ran cold. It was a mirror, cracked and covered in grime, but I could still see my reflection, distorted and wrong. Behind me, just over my shoulder, was the figure, its empty eyes staring into mine, and as I watched, it raised a hand, reaching for me once more. I closed my eyes, my breath hitching, and when I opened them again, I was no longer in the forest. I was back in my room, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the whisper of the forest still echoing faintly in my ears. The clock beside my bed read 3:33 a.m., and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard it, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint whisper of a voice calling my name, and I knew that whatever had begun in that forest was far from over. Waking up in my room should have brought a sense of relief, but it didn't. My skin was clammy, my heart pounding erratically as I stared at the familiar surroundings. The clock on my nightstand still read 3:33 a.m., its red numbers glowing like an ominous reminder that whatever had happened wasn't over. The whispers from the forest were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than any sound. I sat up, my mind racing with the vivid images of the dream, the symbols, the figure, the lantern, and a sense of deep, unshakable dread settled in my chest. It all felt too real, too vivid, more like a memory than a dream. I tried to dismiss it as a nightmare, but something inside me knew better. As I got out of bed, I felt an odd sensation beneath my feet, a dampness. I looked down and saw, to my horror, muddy footprints leading from the window to my bed. They were my size, and I could feel the chill of the forest floor still clinging to my soles. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. How could this be possible? The dream had followed me back, the boundary between reality and nightmare shattered. The next few days were a blur. I went about my routines, but the feeling of being watched never left. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Dark corners in my house felt like they were hiding something that I couldn't see. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear faint whispers, too quiet to understand, but unmistakably there, as though the forest itself had found a way to reach me. I knew I had to do something. I had to understand what was happening, or I would lose my mind. Driven by desperation, I began researching. I searched online, digging through forums dedicated to the paranormal, websites about dreams and ancient folklore. It took hours, days even, before I found something. A mention of the dark forest, a place whispered about in hushed tones in obscure corners of the internet. It was said to be a cursed location, a forest where light never entered, a place where those who wandered too far never returned. My heart pounded as I read accounts eerily similar to my own. People describing the same symbols, the same feeling of being hunted, of seeing a figure that defied logic. I was not alone. Others had experienced it too, and their stories all ended the same way, with disappearance, with madness, with something that none of them could escape. One account stood out, a post by someone named Aaron, who described a cabin in the heart of the forest, a lantern, and a symbol that seemed to hold some terrible power. He wrote of the whispers, of being drawn deeper, and how he had seen a figure that seemed to step out of his dreams and into his waking life. The post ended abruptly, with no further updates. The last line read, "If you find the mirror, it's already too late." My blood ran cold as I remembered the cracked mirror beneath the lantern. It wasn't just a figment of my dream. It was real, and somehow, it was connected to me. I knew I had to find out more, so I searched for any mention of this forest in historical records, old maps, anything that could give me a clue. It was then that I stumbled upon something chilling, an old newspaper article from decades ago. The headline read, "Local man disappears in mysterious woods. Only clue is a lantern left behind." The article detailed the disappearance of a man named Elias Stroud. I blinked, my stomach tightening into a knot. It was my name, and though the photograph was old, grainy, and weathered by time, there was something eerily familiar about the man's face. He looked like me, a ghost from the past, and suddenly, it felt as if the ground had been pulled from under my feet. I read on, my hands trembling. The article spoke of locals who believed the forest was haunted, cursed, a place where time and reality twisted, where the past and present merged, trapping those who wandered in forever. I'd always believed my interest in folklore and the supernatural was just a fascination, but now it felt like something much darker, like I was being pulled towards this place for reasons beyond my understanding. Determined to find out the truth, I drove to the town mentioned in the article, a small, forgotten place on the edge of nowhere. The town itself seemed frozen in time, its streets empty, its buildings old and worn. I found a local diner and, gathering my courage, asked the waitress about the forest. Her face paled, her eyes widening slightly before she quickly looked away. "You shouldn't be asking about that place," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. "People who go there don't come back. It's been that way for as long as anyone can remember." When I pressed her further, she reluctantly gave me the address of an old man, someone who she said might know more. His name was Gareth, and he lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, he greeted me with a look that spoke of recognition, as if he'd been expecting me. His eyes were hollow, tired, and he invited me in without a word. The house was cluttered with relics of the past, old books, photographs, and, most chillingly, a lantern identical to the one from my dream, hanging by the window. Gareth spoke slowly, his voice gravelly, as he recounted tales of the forest, of people being called to it, drawn into its depths by something they could not resist. He spoke of the symbols, the whispers, and the figure that haunted the woods. "The forest isn't just a place," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "It's alive. It chooses people, calls to them, and once you've heard the call, there's no escaping it." I asked him about the mirror, and he grew silent, his face darkening. "The mirror is the key," he finally said. "It shows you the truth, what's really watching, what's waiting. If you saw it, then you're already marked." A chill settled over me, and I knew then that this wasn't just a nightmare. It was a warning, a prelude to something far worse. Whatever had started in the forest wasn't finished with me. The whispers, the symbols, the figure, they were all part of a dark, unfolding story, one that I was now deeply entangled in. And as I left Garrett's house, His final words echoed in my mind. Once the forest has you, it never lets go. I realized then that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The drive to the forest was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if every mile I covered was dragging me further away from safety and deeper into the jaws of something insidious. The sky was overcast, a blanket of dark clouds hanging low, as if to suffocate the world beneath them, and as I neared the edge of the forest, the road seemed to almost disappear into the gloom, swallowed by the oppressive shadows that lay ahead. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white, and my heart thudded in my chest, a steady reminder of the fear I was willingly stepping into. When I arrived, the air was colder than it should have been, an unnatural chill that bit through my clothes and settled in my bones. The forest loomed before me, its twisted trees reaching up to form a jagged barrier against the outside world. I stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the frigid air, and for a moment I hesitated, a small voice in my head screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something stronger, some unseen force, pushed me forward, an invisible thread that tugged at my very being, drawing me in. As I entered the forest, the familiar sense of déjà vu washed over me, a strange mix of recognition and dread. The path was narrow, barely visible beneath the thick layer of decaying leaves that crunched softly underfoot, and every step seemed to carry me further from reality. The trees were impossibly tall, their bark dark and split, and the deeper I went, the less light there was, until it felt like I was walking through a perpetual twilight, a place where the sun had long since forgotten to shine. My skin prickled with unease, the weight of unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. Hours seemed to stretch into days as I walked deeper, the world around me growing more distorted, more wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could hear whispers again, faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each step. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me, urging me forward. I followed the path, my legs moving of their own accord, and soon I came across something I had hoped I wouldn't find: the cabin. It stood exactly as it had in my dream, leaning to one side, its wooden boards warped and decaying. The door was slightly ajar, the inside pitch black, as if the darkness itself had taken up residence within. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached. There was a weight in the air, an oppressive force that seemed to press down on me, making every movement feel labored. I could see the faint flicker of light from a lantern inside, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me to step inside. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open, the creak of the old wood echoing through the silence, and I stepped into the cabin, my breath caught in my throat. The symbols were there again, carved into the walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their twisted forms shifting, morphing, as if they were trying to communicate something dark and terrible. My eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, where I had seen the shadow figure before, but this time it was empty, only the darkness staring back at me. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony that filled my mind, drowning out all rational thought. I took a step forward, and the floor beneath me groaned, the old wood protesting under my weight. Then I saw him, Gareth. He was standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed to mirror my own. He looked at me, his lips moving, but no sound came out. I watched in horror as his body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head, and he collapsed to the ground, his body limp. I rushed to him, my hands shaking as I knelt beside him, but the moment I touched his shoulder, I felt it, a cold, dark energy that seemed to seep into my skin, filling me with a dread so profound that I thought I might drown in it. Gareth's eyes snapped open, and they weren't his anymore. They were black, empty voids that stared into mine, and a twisted smile spread across his face, his lips parting to whisper, "It's too late." His voice was not his own. It was layered, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, a chorus of the damned. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and as I looked around, I realized that the cabin had changed. The walls were closing in, the symbols now glowing bright, their light blinding, and the whispers had become a roar, a deafening sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. I turned and fled, bursting out of the cabin and into the forest, my legs carrying me blindly through the darkness. The trees seemed to move, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to pull me back, and I could hear Garrett's laughter behind me, cold, hollow, echoing through the trees. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body aching, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I knew that if I did, whatever was in that forest would take me, just like it had taken Gareth. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing, my legs giving out beneath me, and I fell to the ground, my body trembling uncontrollably. I looked up, and there, hanging from a twisted tree, was the lantern. Its light was dim, flickering, and as I watched, it began to sway gently, as if moved by an unseen hand. The whispers were still there, faint now, almost a whisper of a whisper, and I knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that this was only the beginning. The forest wasn't done with me. It had brought me here, shown me what it wanted me to see, and now I was waiting. For what, I didn't know. I pushed myself to my feet, my entire body aching, and looked around the clearing. The forest was still, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing down on me, and I knew that I was not alone. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows, it was watching, waiting for me to make my next move. And as I stood there, the lantern swaying gently in the cold breeze, I realized that the nightmare had followed me from my dreams into the waking world, and there was no escaping it. The forest had me now, and it would never let me go. I stood in the clearing, my breath coming in shaky gasps, the lantern's dim light barely pushing back the darkness that encircled me. My body ached from the frantic escape, but there was no safety here. I could feel it, the presence lurking just beyond the circle of light, something ancient, something that wanted me. The forest was too silent. Even the whispers had gone quiet, as if holding their breath, waiting for what was to come. The oppressive silence pressed in on me, a cold sweat running down my spine as I strained to see through the shadows. Suddenly, a rustling sound echoed from the depths of the forest, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, and I knew I wasn't alone. My eyes snapped towards the direction of the sound, and there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, stood the figure. It was barely visible, a silhouette against the darkness, but those eyes, those empty, black voids, were unmistakable. They stared into me, cutting through my fear, freezing me in place. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady drumbeat of panic, as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, each step bringing it closer. I wanted to run, to flee, but my legs wouldn't move, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. The lantern flickered, its light faltering as the figure drew near, and I felt the cold deepen, the temperature dropping until each breath came out in misty puffs. The figure's face was obscured, a blank slate where features should have been, and yet it felt like it was smiling, a malevolent, knowing smile that seemed to promise that my fate was already sealed. The ground beneath me began to shift, the earth rippling like water, and I stumbled, my foot sinking into the soft, damp soil. I looked down and saw the symbols again, those same twisted, glowing runes, now etched into the ground in a perfect circle around me. They pulsed with an eerie light, as if alive, and I knew that whatever force had brought me here was now ready to finish what it had started. The figure reached the edge of the clearing, its tall, elongated form casting a shadow that seemed to stretch towards me, the darkness clawing at the edges of the light. It raised one long, spindly hand, pointing towards the center of the clearing, and I followed its gesture, my eyes drawn to a small mound of earth just beneath the lantern. There, half buried in the dirt, was an old, weathered book. I hesitated, fear clutching at my chest, but I knew that this was what the forest wanted me to see. Slowly, my hands trembling, I knelt and pulled the book free from the earth. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather peeling away, and as I opened it, a chill ran through me. The pages were filled with names, written in a script that seemed to shift and change as I stared at it. But one name stood out, my own. It was there, written in dark ink that seemed to glisten like fresh blood, and beneath it was a date. Today's date. My breath caught in my throat, a cold dread settling in my chest as I realized what this meant. The figure moved closer, and I felt its presence, a deep, dark energy that seemed to seep into my very soul. The whispers returned, louder now, deafening, a chorus of voices urging me to finish what had begun. The book seemed to burn in my hands, the symbols on its pages glowing brightly, and I knew that I had to make a choice that would decide whether I would leave this place or be lost to it forever. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping, each one demanding something different, their words a blur in my mind. The figure stood before me now, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I knew that whatever it was waiting for my answer. The weight of its gaze bore down on me, and in that moment, I understood. This was not just about me. This forest, this presence, it thrived on fear, on the choices of those who wandered into its grasp. It was a test, a ritual, and the book was the key. My fingers brushed against the last page, and I felt something cold, something metallic. I looked down and saw a small, rusted knife embedded in the spine of the book. The whispers screamed now, a cacophony that filled my mind, and I knew what the forest wanted. It wanted me to choose, sacrifice myself, or someone else, to break free from its grasp. The symbols on the ground glowed brighter, the runes twisting, shifting, and the figure took another step forward, its empty face mere inches from mine. Tears filled my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized the truth. I had been brought here to make a choice, and there was no escaping it. I raised the knife, my hand trembling, the weight of the decision crushing me. I could feel the darkness pressing in, the cold fingers of the forest wrapping around me, urging me to give in, to surrender to the fear and despair. The figure watched, its presence overpowering, and I knew that it was waiting for my choice, for the final act that would seal my fate. With a trembling breath, I made my decision. I closed my eyes, the whispers still roaring in my ears, and brought the knife down, driving it into the earth beneath me. The moment the blade touched the ground, the whispers stopped, the forest falling into an eerie silence. The figure froze, its form flickering, and then, without a sound, it began to dissolve, the darkness unraveling until there was nothing left but the faint glow of the lantern. The earth beneath me trembled, the symbols fading, and I felt a rush of cold air, the oppressive weight lifting. I opened my eyes, and the clearing was empty. The book was gone, the figure was gone, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I stumbled to my feet, my entire body shaking, and looked around, the forest now still, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me away from that place, the lantern's light fading behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, the line between the darkness and the world beyond. I burst through the trees, collapsing onto the ground, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I was free, but I knew that I had left a part of myself behind, a part that the forest would always hold. The nightmares haven't stopped since that night. The whispers return whenever I close my eyes, and sometimes I see the symbols, etched into the shadows, pulsing with a dark, sinister light. And I know that the forest isn't done with me. It never lets go, not really. It waits, watches, and one day, it will call me back. The nightmares became a part of me. Every time I closed my eyes, I was there again, standing in the forest, the darkness pressing in, the whispers echoing all around me. The figure's hollow eyes haunted my dreams, and each time I awoke, I could still feel its presence, as though it had followed me back into the waking world. My room no longer felt safe. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners of my home darker, as if the forest had found a way to breach the walls that separated reality from nightmare. One night as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. That rustling sound, soft at first, like leaves brushing against the window, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat, and there it was. The same familiar chill that I had felt in the forest, creeping up my spine. I turned to look at the clock, the red numbers glowing in the dark. 3:33 a.m. My pulse quickened, the memories of the clearing, the symbols, and the figure flooding back with a wave of dread that made my skin prickle. The air in my room seemed to grow colder, and I heard the whisper again, my name, softly spoken, as if carried on the wind. It was coming from the direction of the mirror that hung on the wall opposite my bed. I stared at it, my eyes wide, and for a moment I saw something moving within the reflection, a shadow, slipping just out of sight. I blinked, my heart pounding, and the reflection was empty again, just me, wide-eyed and terrified. The next morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The edge of the mirror was etched with a symbol, small and almost invisible, but unmistakably the same as those from the forest. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold glass, and for a brief moment, I felt it, a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips. I pulled my hand back, my skin crawling, and realized then that the forest wasn't just a place I could escape from. It was a part of me now, a mark that would never fade. Determined to understand what was happening, I began to research once again. I combed through old texts, journals, and online forums, searching for any clue that could explain what I had experienced. That's when I found a mention of the Marked Ones, people who had been chosen by the forest, who had glimpsed its dark truths and were forever connected to it. Their stories were fragmented, scattered across time, but one detail was always the same. They all saw the symbols, they all heard the whispers, and they all spoke of a presence that haunted them, even beyond the boundaries of the forest. One entry, written by someone named M, stood out to me. It described a way to sever the connection, a ritual involving an object from the forest, the lantern. I remembered a lantern hanging from the tree, the way its dim light had seemed to hold back the darkness, and I knew that if I wanted any chance of breaking free, I had to go back. The thought filled me with dread, but I also knew that I couldn't keep living like this, with the constant feeling of being watched, the whispers growing louder each night. I returned to the forest at dusk, the air thick with an unnatural stillness, and as I stepped between the trees, the oppressive weight of its presence settled over me once more. The path was just as I remembered, narrow, winding, leading deeper into the heart of the forest, where the shadows grew darker and the light of the outside world faded away. The further I went, the more the whispers returned, faint at first, but steadily growing louder, like a chorus of voices urging me onward. When I reached the clearing, the lantern was there, hanging from the twisted tree, its light flickering weakly. The symbols on the ground glowed faintly, and the air was thick with the same cold energy that I had felt before. I knew what I had to do. I had to take the lantern, bring it back to the mirror, and complete the ritual. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the metal cold beneath my fingers, and as I pulled it from the branch, the entire forest seemed to shudder. The whispers grew frantic, the ground beneath me shifting, and I knew that whatever was watching wasn't pleased. I ran, the lantern heavy in my hand, the forest closing in around me, branches clawing at my arms, shadows shifting, moving, as if trying to stop me. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps slow but steady, the whispers growing into a deafening roar that filled my mind, drowning out all thought. The edge of the forest was just ahead, the line between the darkness and the world beyond, and with a final burst of strength, I broke free, stumbling out onto the road, the whispers falling silent in an instant. Back home, the ritual seemed simple. I placed the lantern in front of the mirror, the light flickering weakly, casting strange shadows across the room. The air was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones, and as I stared at my reflection, I saw it again, that shadow, moving just behind me. I spoke the words I had found in the journal, my voice barely a whisper, and watched as the symbols in the mirror began to glow, the light from the lantern intensifying until it was almost blinding. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The chill lifted, the shadows faded, and the whispers fell silent. But then, I saw it. The figure, standing just behind me in the reflection, its hollow eyes staring into mine, a smile spreading across its faceless void. My heart skipped a beat, a cold dread washing over me as I realized that the ritual hadn't severed the connection. It had strengthened it. The light from the lantern went out, plunging the room into darkness, and I heard it again. The whisper, soft and mocking, right next to my ear. "You can't escape." I turned, my breath catching, but the room was empty. The mirror was dark, the reflection gone, but I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. And now, as I sit here writing this, I know that whatever I did that night, whatever choice I made, it wasn't enough. The forest still has its hold on me. The symbols appear in places I cannot explain, carved into the wood of my desk, drawn in the condensation on the bathroom mirror, etched into the shadows of my own mind. The figure is still there, always just out of sight, its presence a constant reminder that I am never alone. So I ask you, the one who has stayed with me until the end, do you think you would be able to resist the call? Could you walk away, knowing that the forest might follow you, that the line between dream and reality could shatter at any moment? If you've ever had an experience like this, if you've ever felt the darkness watching, leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Maybe together, we can find a way to break free. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Because the truth is, the nightmares don't always end when we wake up. Sometimes they're only just beginning, and what happened in that dark forest may only be the start of something much, much worse.